Reading and writing poetry. Teachers can incorporate poetry into all 4 instructional patterns. They share poems with students on topics related to literature focus units and thematic units. In literature circles and reading workshops, students read books of poetry as well as other books. Students can write poems as projects, and once students learn how to write poetry, they often choose to do so during writing workshops. One of the articles I researched talked about using slam poetry. Slam poetry is a way for students to express experiences and values through written and verbal communication. And traditionally, students would have to memorize and recite poetry, but the slam method allows them to appreciate poetry and enhance their relationship to language. Slam poetry integrates everyday life and allows students to talk about everyday issues, such as family life, social issues, and major events that happen in their lives. Typically, slam poetry is mainly spoken and impromptu, but this could easily be incorporated into a classroom by having students write out what they wanted to say first, and then perform the poetry in front of their peers. Teachers will need to provide examples of poetry as a scaffold for students to see how poetry is structured and expressed. There are benefits to using slam poetry, such as teaching nonviolence, leadership, character, individuality, and social change. Slam poetry allows students to write and perform experiences that matter to them, which in turn makes learning more meaningful. The second article I researched, Poetry Inside Out, Bridging Cultures Through Language, focused on an in-school writing program that offered students a way to learn and write poetry through translation. Through the use of translation, students will use what they learn from other poems as a model for their own poetry. Poetry Inside Out is a literacy project that builds students' abilities to read for understanding, effectively communicating, and fundamentally understanding the power of the imagination. Literary translation is a key component to this program in order to challenge the students to think about the power of the words, meaning, culture, and context. They also learn that syntax, grammar, vocabulary, rhythm, and nuances of both source and target language are key components of good translation. There are 4 basic principles to using this program, such as inspire, imagine, practice, and apply. Inspire focuses on the importance of inspiration in order for students to imagine themselves in a certain role. Practice allows the students to get better in order to apply what they learn and understand the importance of using their minds. The last article I researched was Positive Expectations, a reflective tale in the teaching of writing that focused on how teachers could motivate students to complete difficult writing assignments. Through the use of poetry, students developed positive expectations by helping each other map strategies for reading and writing. The idea of this approach is to get students to think about why a writing assignment is difficult. The more students grasp why an assignment is difficult for them, the more insight they gain and therefore become more motivated to engage in learning. Many of the students in the article were not motivated to read the poem, let alone write about it. After discussing a few strategies with the teacher, and as a whole class, the students were able to implement those strategies to understand the poem. The students began to talk about how they read the poem, how many times they read it, and what lines they were not able to understand. The students realized that through class discussions, they were able to help each other by giving each other ways to get started on writing about the poem. One instructional strategy that students can use to gain and show understanding of a poem is through the use of choral reading. In choral reading, students take turns reading a poem together. Students can arrange the poem for choral reading so that individual students, pairs of students, and small groups read certain lines or stanzas. There are 4 possible arrangements for choral reading: echo reading, leader and chorus reading, small group reading, and cumulative reading. In echo reading, the leader reads each line and then the group repeats it. In leader and chorus reading, the leader reads the main part of the poem and the group reads the refrain or chorus in unison. Small group reading has the class divide into 2 or more groups, and each group reads one part of the poem. Lastly, in cumulative reading, one student or group reads the first line or stanza, and then another student or group joins in as each line or stanza is read to create a cumulative effect. To make choral reading even more fun, students can add props or play music in the background in order to enhance their presentation. There are several ways teachers can assess students' experiences with poetry. They can observe students when they participate in poetry reading activities, as well as keep notes of students as they read and respond to poems. Teachers can also conference with students to see what type of poetry interests them. Students can also write reflections about their learning and work habits while interacting with poetry assignments. Lastly, teachers can have the students assess their own poetry by explaining which writing strategies they used in a particular poem and what poetic forms they used. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation on reading and writing poetry. It is important for teachers to know that they can invite students to write poems as part of most patterns of practice, and many students are willing to write poetry when they are given a choice.